começar? Penso que sim. Estão-nos todos a ouvir bem, não estão? Estão, ok. Okay, so good evening everyone and welcome to FIC.A. My name is Catarina Canelas. I'm a TV journalist. And last year I was the author of a documentary about plastic. It was called Plastic, the New Continent, Plástico Novo Continente, and it talked about the threats to human health, the pollution in the planet, and the killing animals in the ocean. So, in the next hour I'll moderate our talk. The subject is From Knowledge to Conservation, a joint effort around the world. At the end, we'll have some few minutes so you can put your questions to our three speakers. And they are Inês Carvalho. Inês, she's a conservation biologist and a postdoctoral researcher here at IGC. We have Christophe Thébault. Is a professor in the Evolution and Biological Diversity Lab at University of Toulouse. And Lunez Chiki, I said correctly? A main researcher. Good evening. First of all, what do we need to know about the IGC? Because most of us don't know. Here they know, but some people don't know. And what do you do, and what's the importance of the investigation worldwide?
Okay, so good evening. So as you said, my name is Lunez Chiki. I'm an investigator here at Instituto Gulbenkian, Ciência. We're going to have some pictures behind showing population and conservation genetics, ou genética de populações e da conservação. O Instituto Gulbenkian, como vemos nestas imagens, é localizado aqui em Oeiras, tem 32 grupos de investigação e mais ou menos 400 pessoas com mais de 40 nacionalidades. O nosso grupo, Genética de Populações e da Conservação, tem interesse nas perguntas em relação à diversidade genética de espécies ameaçadas em várias regiões do mundo. Temos investigação em Bornéu, onde trabalhamos com colegas como Benoît Gossens. Temos trabalho em Madagascar. Temos onde trabalhamos em tentar perceber a diversidade das espécies que existem, desde pequenos camaleões até lemurs, como este que nós estamos a ver agora, a oeste. A tentativa do grupo é também de fazer investigação, como vamos ver mais tarde, com espécies também portuguesas, em particular os golfinhos do Sado, dos quais a Inês vai falar mais tarde, e que é localizada no Sado e faz parte de uma espécie que tem uma grande distribuição. Mas a Inês falará mais disto e partilhou estas fotos conosco. O tipo de investigação que fazemos no IGC, relembrando que há vários grupos de investigação e que nós somos destes grupos, é de misturar uma parte de trabalho do campo, em Madagascar, por exemplo, onde foram tiradas estas fotos, mas também tem um trabalho depois deste trabalho de grupo, onde vamos explorar regiões que foram pouco exploradas. Conseguimos trazer amostras aqui para Portugal, para o Instituto Gulbenkian de Ciência, onde vamos fazer várias análises genéticas para tentar perceber esta diversidade genética. Depois, para perceber ainda melhor, temos todo um tratamento de bioinformática, que aparece aqui. Utilizamos modelos matemáticos e partilhei esta imagem só para assustar um bocado. Agora vamos sair de onde estamos, aqui em Portugal, e para tentar repor Madagascar talvez no mapa. Eu acho que muitas pessoas aqui sabem que Madagascar está localizado no Oceano Índico, e uma coisa importante é relembrar o tamanho. Muitas vezes as pessoas não reparam que Madagascar é enorme, 6 vezes maior que Portugal, e então é uma grande ilha, a quarta ilha do mundo. Nós trabalhamos em conservação e, como qualquer trabalho de investigação, tem uma grande parte de colaborações internacionais. Antananarivo, capital, mas também trabalhamos com a Universidade de Mahajanga, onde vemos estas fotos. E nós tentamos misturar neste trabalho em Madagascar uma parte mais de investigação, descobertas de zonas que foram pouco exploradas, como se vê nestas fotos, mas também uma parte de ensino, de formação de estudantes das universidades e de formação sim, em várias técnicas. Tentamos também identificar novas espécies ou novas populações ou estimar os tamanhos das populações. Isto é importantíssimo porque vai ajudar depois também no trabalho da conservação, para, por exemplo, identificar zonas onde as populações não têm tantos indivíduos. E este pode servir depois quando trabalhamos com instituições que têm um papel muito importante na conservação, como, por exemplo, a IUCN, que é International Union for the Conservation of Nature. E nós, quando trabalhamos com estas espécies, por exemplo, tem uma parte onde tentamos estimar, como eu expliquei, como neste relatório, a identificar entre as espécies de lemurs aquelas que têm poucos indivíduos, populações muito reduzidas, e então para fazer um update, não sei como é que se diz, do estatuto de conservação destas espécies. Por exemplo, infelizmente, entre as espécies sobre as quais trabalhamos, tínhamos identificado um dos primatas mais em perigo do mundo e participamos a estimar os tamanhos destas populações. Portanto, este trabalho tem partes assim que não são tão positivas, vamos dizer, onde identificamos espécies que são mesmo ameaçadas, mas também, às vezes, descobrimos, como aqui, uma nova espécie ou novas populações, vamos dizer, de lemurs ratos. Este é um lemur que está, como estão a ver, numa pequena... Aqui entraram 2. Quando se abriu a gaiola, descobriu-se que havia 2. E esta espécie de lemur rato é uma população que foi, de uma certa maneira, mostramos que era bastante diferente de outras populações. E como eu tinha dito, trabalhamos também com escolas, mas esta é uma coisa que, por exemplo, começamos a fazer mesmo só com estudantes que trabalharam conosco em Madagascar. Por isso nós não entramos nas escolas, são mesmo os estudantes malagasy que vão na escola e que falam com os miúdos e mostram coisas de conservação. Tudo isso para voltar ao que nós fazemos, e falei bastante e estou a acabar. Como eu tentei dizer, tem um Instituto Gulbenkian de Ciência, que é um instituto internacional, tem 40 grupos, nós somos um destes grupos, tem investigação em muitas áreas, eu acho que vocês podem descobrir isso tudo durante a semana, e o nosso grupo faz conservação, desde o trabalho de campo até o laboratório, a modelação matemática e as simulações.
Thank you, Lionel.
Eu acho que espero que fui claro e não reparei que passei para o português, era tarde demais.
Todos entendemos,
não sei se eu tenho que
pedir
desculpa.
Mas ali o Christophe também sabe o trabalho que faz.
Exatamente.
Portanto, percebeu perfeitamente. We all understand it. And we are going to talk more about it.
Okay.
And your project and your work. But now I have here Inês. Inês, I think almost people who are in here love ocean and love the rivers, and we all love dolphins. You have been doing an amazing work with dolphins and working in their conservation in Sado. Tell us about it. What do you do, and what's the most significant data that you have?
Okay, so I work with Lunas, so we are working in the same questions, but in the different environments. So what I try to understand in this case, in the projects that I'm involved, is in a broad scale is how many populations of bottlenose dolphins are around Portugal and Spain and in Azores and Madeira. And then more focus on the Sado population, because this resident population is unique, because it's the only resident population of bottlenose dolphins in Portugal, and is one of the few resident populations in Europe. And the population has been decreasing in numbers since the 80s. And right now, what we are really trying to understand is what is the genetic diversity of this population, if this population is genetic isolated from the others, dolphins that are around. If they, because there is the population is so small, we are talking about less than 30 animals. Right now is around 27, and in the beginning of the studies were around 45.
Why Sado?
Why they live in Sado?
Yes.
Because there is a lot of food available.
Because I think it's one of the most polluted areas.
But dolphins don't know that.
They don't know.
No.
It's a threat to them.
Yes, it
also.
is. Yeah, yeah. So, but they live there because they have a lot of food. They have a lot of availability of food, and because of that, they live in the entire. Of course, every day or most of the days they come out to the adjacent region. But then they are in the estuary every day. Yeah.
So the conclusions that the main conclusions.
We don't have.
You don't have it.
All the
Okay.
conclusions. So some work are more advanced. Others are still on process. So until now, what we discover is, well, not discover because we already have idea of this. So we confirm that this population is genetically differentiate from the others. So this means that they don't mate a lot with the dolphins outside of the saddle. Of course, because the population is so small, the genetic diversity of this population is smaller when we compare with the others. And more problematic is the level of inbreeding. So how the animals related to each other, they are really like a family. And if they mate with family members, is not good in terms of genetics. And because the population is so small, and there are a part of the population that is very old. We know the animals since the 80s, so they are almost in the end of their lives.
So they are in danger now.
Yeah, so this population is threatened because it's so small that, of course, that we can say that. Yeah.
What other threats can we?
Well, they live in a, in a big estuary, very close to a city, with a lot of industry in the region, a lot of tourism. So there are several threats. There are underwater noise. There are habitat degradation in general. But the most problematic one is the pollution, the chemical pollution. We know that some of the pollutants that accumulate in these animals have a negative impact in their health. And of course, and we have, for the first time, that is something that is not genetic related, but we have data for the first time for the contaminants of these animals. And I cannot say too much, but the levels are really high.
Are high.
Yes.
Thank you, Inês. We now are listening to Christophe. Good evening. Christophe, tell us about your work in Toulouse, and you have been in a different group of islands in the world, even in Azores, Madeira, and New Guinea, I think. And tell us about the biodiversity that you found and your studies, the recent studies.
Thank you. So first, let me thank the organizers for inviting me here tonight in Lisbon. It's not that far from an hour and 30 minutes flight, so it's we are kind of neighbors. I didn't realize that fully until yesterday. So I'm a professor at the University of Toulouse, where I teach evolutionary biology and ecology, and also ornithology, although in other words, the study of birds, the scientific study of birds. And so I have had a lifelong passion for islands, which it took me some time to understand why I was interested so much in islands. But actually, I was born in Brittany, in the western part of France, a place where there are lots of islands. So I think there's been a fascination for islands ever since I was a kid. But it's only recently that I realized there was a connection between my life as a kid and what I then became later in my professional life. So I have this passion for islands, and I have spent a lot of time investigating biodiversity in several groups of islands around Madagascar, which is a link with my first link with Lunes. The first approach was basically a conservation one, try to figure out what the status of some species were and what the possible threats were on some of these island birds. Island birds are actually on average much more threatened than continental birds, because islands are small places. They are very small places, in fact, and they've been, in the case of oceanic islands, volcanic islands like the Azores, for example, they're usually free of predators like carnivores or cats, dogs. And ever since humans have colonized those islands, they've taken with them these animals, and they're exerting a strong predation pressure on many of these island organisms, especially birds, which evolved actually in the absence of predators and are very tame. And so in many groups of islands, I mean, the consequence of that has been extinction of species and increasing threats on the species that didn't go extinct. So my first approach was to get involved into these discussions about the threats there were to island organisms, and especially birds. And then I figured out that there were lots of questions that were unanswered about why island birds were so interesting. It's enough to think about Darwin's finches. I suppose many of you have already heard about Darwin's finches, a group of birds that diversified in the Galapagos Island, and which are told to have inspired Charles Darwin when he visited the Galapagos during the travel he made on the Beagle. And so, in fact, I mean, the Darwin's finches are just one example of fascinating cases of bird groups that have diversified on island, and it's always been like kind of mysterious where these birds came from initially, and why they actually produced so many species in
What can genetics tell us about it?
Well, I mean, that's where genetics comes in. I mean, when I was a student, in fact, these were like unanswered questions, and then after my PhD, I did a postdoc in a group where DNA sequencing was becoming more and more available, and so it turned out that using DNA and the tools of population genetics that people like Lunes are actually developing would be an excellent way of trying to reconstruct the history of these bird groups. And so I was in a way at the right place at the right time. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, I had no knowledge at all of genetics when I was, at that place. But then I decided maybe that's something I need to learn, because then if I learn it, I may actually get into answering these questions that have been,
And that-
mysteries ever since people have documented what was on these islands. And this is what we made, actually. What we did, I went in the field and then collected
you go to
samples.
the field and you went with your team, with your.
Actually, at that time, I had a very little team. I was like more a single-man orchestra, which and
But-
so.
And that's great because you find out a new species of birds.
That's
and I
recently.
think in 80
Yeah.
years, it's the second time that.
So that's during a field trip.
That
we did.
happens.
Yeah. So I mean, I spent a lot of time
Wow.
working around Madagascar. We never found something that was close to be a new species. But then I moved to New Guinea recently. 10 years ago, we started investigations in New Guinea. So New Guinea is like this big island, which is between Indonesia and Australia. It's a very interesting part of the world. It's probably one of the richest place on Earth, actually, with some parts of the Amazon and the Congo Basin. So we started doing investigation there, and New Guinea is so far away, and it's very mountainous, even though it's been populated by people for probably more than 60,000 years. There are still vast areas where very few people go because it's difficult to access. There is not necessarily water, even though it's rainforest. We decided to go there and try to get more data on this, on several of these mountains, especially since there are still very large untouched forest areas in New Guinea, which is quite unique, actually. Having visited, South America, Madagascar, Africa, it's very difficult to find huge places where you have the forest from the sea to the top of the mountains. And New Guinea is still that in many, many places. So anyway, we decided net, because we're using nets, as you may have seen on the slideshow.
How do you know it's a new species?
Well, initially you don't know. But you get to the net and you find a bird that doesn't look like all the birds that have been described in the book, and so therefore you think, wow, that's weird. Why is it not in the book? So either it's missing from the book, or it's something that was not described before. Found this bird. Of course, we contacted all the people who were experts on the birds of New Guinea, and some of them were saying, well, it looks like maybe it's something that has not been described. Others were more skeptical, saying, well, maybe it's just like, I don't know, a different population from the rest, and so on. So anyway, what we do in that case is we go to people like Lunes, or equivalent to Lunes, and we say, so maybe we should use genes or genomes, to sort that out. And so what we did was to conduct actually population genetic analysis of that bird, and including also populations of closely related species. And it took us like several years actually to get that study completed, to make sure that what we had found was clearly a distinct evolutionary lineage.
And we are going to talk more about it.
Yeah.
Because Lunes, as Christophe says, genetics is with you.
Mm-hmm.
So what can genetics tell us about animals?
Big question. Okay, so now I'll try to stick to English. So we tried, when you look at nature, as Christophe says, or as Ines knows, you see animals, you see diversity, you see plants, and the question is how much of what you see corresponds, for instance, to different species, to different populations of the same species. There can be some species that have a lot of diversity physically, morphologically, and others that have less. And the more we started looking at genetic data, that is getting samples and reading some bits of their DNA, we started realizing that sometimes the diversity we see, let's say, outside is not necessarily reflected by the diversity within. So sometimes you see things that look the same, and with genetic data you realize that maybe there are two different species. And sometimes you see things that that look very different, but actually genetically they're one somehow big thing that can be varying, but they're part of it. So the genetic data can be seen as another dimension, not necessarily better, but another dimension, something you can look into that can be very interesting. An advantage of genetics is that we know, I would say, nearly exactly how it is transmitted from generation to generation. For instance, that's not the case of a beak. For instance, a beak, we don't know exactly how a beak is created and how it's transferred. It's not like the parents takes it out and gives it to the kids. It's transmitted probably genetically, but how, we don't know exactly, okay? So the genes, we know how they are. And because of that, people have developed for more than a century methods to, mathematical methods or approaches that allow us to quantify and study the properties of genes in the population. And so genetic data can be used to look at the diversity as it is today. So for instance, you could look, let's say, a lemur species, because you sample individuals in a forest, in another forest, in another forest, and you start looking, and maybe you find in one forest there is much more diversity. And in another one, there is much less diversity, and you wonder, why is it? Is it because this one is isolated? Is it because this one has been there for a very, very long time? And what we try to do is actually try to answer, to both use genetic to describe, and then try to understand how the picture you see today is the result of what we call an evolutionary process until today. And this evolutionary process can be expansions, colonizations of new places, a decrease because of change of climate, populations that were connected and climate has been changing and they're separated, humans arrive somewhere, they destroy part of the habitat, and populations that were connected stop being connected. And all this kind of information is reflected in the genes. And what people in our areas try to do is actually try to see what can we say. What can we say when we look at that diversity?
For instance, I read something that I was very curious about it, because I read that we can, through genetic, we can, for instance, see the level of stress in an animal. Is that possible?
Through genetics, I'm not sure. No. No, I think
because I
maybe
didn't understand that.
No, okay. What can happen is that maybe the thing is that to get samples in nature,
okay,
there are different ways. So sometimes you can, for instance, capture an animal or a plant. I mean, a plant is easier, I guess, sometimes. So you capture the animal, and you could take, for instance, blood, as is often done for birds. You can take a feather, because the feather is attached and has a few cells. You can take hair that you take from the animal, but it's not the hair. It's usually when you take the hair, you take a few cells, and the cells have DNA. And I think people see that in TV shows like CSI or things like that. Or when you, I mean, well, anyway. So you can take tissue, or you can also collect in the field fecal material. Even urine. Some people have been able to extract DNA from wolves that had urinated in a tree, and they could not catch the wolf, and they took bark, so the part outside of the tree, and managed to get DNA. So there are many ways to find the cells that have the DNA, okay? And sometimes when people look at fecal material, they also can look at hormones and other molecules that are informative about stress. And on the same sample, they also get some cells, which were from the intestine, that are in the fecal material, and they can extract DNA from that. But I don't think, unless maybe you look at what is called sort of marks on the DNA, but it's not in the genetics, it's more marks on the DNA that can reflect stress, because you have these proteins that can activate or deactivate some genes, and this is maybe, so I'm not sure if what you read was the fact that people
that's why
extracted...
I was curious, like,
fecal
this possible?
so hormones, or if they looked at how a person that is stressed has in his DNA marks that are not the sequence. So it's not the DNA itself that has the...
And we are seeing in we saw in the images the lemurs. We worked with them in Madagascar, and we are talking about the stress level of the animals. You also have seen that in the lemurs. They are endangered species. So we all know the sweet lemurs, they are very sweet, and we know Madagascar in the movie for children, but the reality is very different.
Well, so maybe to give some ideas is that, so as I think we saw the map of Madagascar that gives an idea of the size of Madagascar. I mean, and Madagascar is not only huge, but it's highly diverse. So you have areas that are like deserts. You have areas that are highly humid and highly mountainous. And you have areas that are, let's say not exactly, but that would look a bit like Mediterranean kind of landscape. Okay, you have really a huge diversity of types of habitats. And the number of recognized species of lemurs today, to simplify, is above 100, okay? If you went back 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, people thought that there were about 30, 35 species of lemurs. Now we recognize about 100 or more. And many of these species are actually in very small regions, okay? So they live in very limited areas. And because of that, when that area is deforested, when this area loses habitat, when that species has nowhere else to go, because that's where it lives. So there are many species of lemurs that are threatened. So in the report that we saw at some point, which was based on the work of many different scientists working in Madagascar, we had estimated that most lemurs were threatened at one level or another. And at the time, it led to the statement, which I think is always disputable, that lemurs were, as a group, the most endangered group of mammals, because it had like 95% of the species for which we considered that they were among the most threatened categories. You remember there is this institution called IUCN, so International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and people know about them because they do this thing called the Red List. And they try to analyze the situation for many, many, many species, mainly animals, mainly vertebrates, but they also try to do that on other groups. And what they do is that they have these categories, like extinct, extinct in the wild, critically endangered, and these are the worst, of course. Extinct is gone. Extinct in the wild, when the species is still alive, maybe in a zoo. And critically endangered is the worst for a species. And they identified several lemur species, for instance, as critically endangered. And then you have endangered and vulnerable, which are also very seriously under threat. And altogether, there were like 95% of the species for which we thought that they were endangered, vulnerable, or critically endangered. So, yeah, I'm not sure I fully answered.
Yes. I think we all understood here. Inês, it's very different to study marine animals.
Well, it's different.
What's the biggest challenge in marine animals?
Well, first of all, is to find them. Well, the saddle dolphins are particular because it's much easier to find, but if you study marine mammals like stations in other parts of the world, the biggest problem is, where you take more time, is try to find them. The challenge, normally this kind of research is expensive, so that is a challenge. And then because cetaceans live under the water most of the time. If we are on the boat, we only see, you know, a small fragment of their lives. So we only see them when they come to the surface to breathe. So that's why genetics is a very important tool to study this kind of animals, because we can get information that otherwise it will be very difficult to, even for example, to know if he's a female or a male. Most of dolphins, for example, don't have dimorphism, so they are equal. And if we take a sample, we can know if he's a male or a female.
Or a female.
So genetics in this kind of species that are difficult to follow and difficult to collect data can give huge information.
You study mostly in Sado now. You are studying there, but we have a big coast in Portugal. What do you see in the rest of the coast, and what can you tell us about all the deaths that we every day we hear on TV, everywhere, that oh, I saw a dead dolphin at the beach, and it's happening more and more and more and more. What can you tell us about it?
Okay, so, well, in Portugal mainland, there are a lot of dolphins. People don't realize and sometimes thinks that in Portugal mainland is only Sado, but there is cetaceans all over, especially dolphins, common dolphin, bottlenose dolphin, and so on. But then the animals, sometimes when they die, they come and they strand to the beach. And they can strand for several reasons. Well, they can die because they are old or because they are with some kind of disease. And then there are other causes. And the most frequent cause is fishers' interactions. Of course, in Portugal, we fish. We have a lot of fish.
Yes.
There are a lot of in the entire coast. There are a lot of fishery ports, and there are species that of dolphins that are very coastal. So they live very close to the coast. So of course there are interactions, and some of them then, if they are caught in the net, then they die, because if they cannot come to the surface to breathe, then they will die. I think we cannot say yet that is more and more. We have to realize that now more and more people
Talked about it.
Yeah,
Okay.
because there are social media, because people have a cell phone with a camera, and before people went to the beach, saw a dead dolphin, and we don't know. Now we see, like, it seems like every day, because a lot of people go have a camera, take a picture, and put on. So I'm not saying that there are not more, but I don't think there are studies that we can say that the numbers are like increasing like every year.
We just know that there are more threats nowadays, because
Yes.
you have more pollution, you have
Yes.
the problem of the fishing nets,
Yes.
you have the problem of the plastic.
Mm,
You
yeah.
also study whales, and I know in my work, my doc, I saw lots of whales in the world with the stomach full of plastic, and they
yeah.
are dying of that, and it's more and more and more, and
And I'm not saying that it's the numbers. I'm not saying that it's not the case that the numbers
Yes.
are increasing. I'm just saying that we don't have studies
the studies
that
can
can
prove that.
prove that. Yeah.
Okay, Christoph, back to the birds. The islands are more far away than mainland New Guinea, for example. So there you have more biodiversity. That's why, because we are not there, humankind, our species is not there. So
Well, we are actually.
because we are a threat.
Well, I mean, it depends.
Are,
I mean,
are
there
we
are
the main threat to a species? The other species?
small volcanic islands that are in the middle of the ocean. Most of them, they were not inhabited by humans like a few centuries ago. They were colonized mostly by Westerners. And the arrival of Westerners, as I said before, with the cats, the dogs, the rats, and so on, has been devastating, actually, on these small islands. But then if places like New Guinea, I mean, it's a bit of peculiar because New Guinea has been colonized by humans a long time ago. And still, you know, the island is covered with forest. And so it looks like New Guinea, and so even though New Guinea has been inhabited by people for a long time, the density of people overall was not that great across most of New Guinea, apart from some valleys, but I mean, on average, it was like very low density. And also it looks like people have been, in a way, very aware of the diversity of nature, with which they were interacting quite a lot, using, I mean, animals as food, animals as source of ornaments, like feathers, you know, to put in your hair or whatever. But it looks like they've been quite, in a way, quite cautious, you know, not to impact too much the nature surrounding them. So New Guinea is also peculiar in the sense that the social structure of human populations is very particular, with small villages next to each other, very territorial, and so therefore you have a small territory, and so if you don't want to deplete your resources, it looks like you have to manage it in some ways. So anyway, the consequence of that is that New Guinea has still a fauna which we can consider today as little impacted by very old human colonizations. But of course, this is changing very quickly. I mean, in the last 50 years, I would say capitalism, industrialization has taken over, and now they are cutting. Forests are being destroyed at an increasing rate, to be replaced by oil palm plantations, mining. I mean, it's the same kind of problems that Lunes was raising earlier. And therefore, even though now, I mean, in New Guinea, I mean, there aren't so many birds that you could say are threatened. Even birds of paradise, which are very well known, you know, in New Guinea, I mean, pretty much they're not threatened. You know, they are still quite common in the forest. There are other species. One of them was shown here on the slideshow, pigeons, big pigeons. There are 4 species. One of them is actually probably quite similar, I mean, quite highly threatened right now. But there are very few threatened species in New Guinea.
It's a paradise for them.
So it's very different from Madagascar from
Yes.
that perspective. You know, it's like Madagascar has lots of threatened species. New Guinea has very few threatened species. So either it's because for some reasons, you know, species have been more resistant, you know, to human pressure in New Guinea, but this seems very unlikely. Or there's been a way of living, perhaps, you know, in New Guinea, which is entirely forested, which has, in a way, spared, you know, the animal populations, so that today we still have most of the species quite abundant, you know, across the forest.
I saw a documentary, a recently documentary, maybe last year, I think, with Sir David Attenborough, and he was showing and saying that the wonderful world in his youngest years we had, and then the recently world.
Sorry,
So
I
it's
didn't
in
get
the recent world. You know, he was
Yeah.
talking about, oh, how wonderful it was when I was a young boy and a young man,
Sure,
because
yeah.
he saw it all over the world, and how terrible is the world right now comparing. And you
Yeah.
said something very important, and this is for the three of you to talk about it. You said that we find more differences in the last, for instance, 20 years than in the last 80 years. So
Sure,
what do you think about this? All of you.
Ines,
Ines.
please.
Well, I think because more and more humans have impacts, and the impacts are happened in a fast way. So I think our impact is spread all over, and there are more and more threats. And I think today some populations or species that are endangered, they are in danger because not only because just one threat, but because of several different threats that is much more difficult to preserve, because we can control one, but we cannot. It's much more difficult to control
So
several, and some of them we cannot control, like climate change and all the things that are going on. So I think is several things happen at the same time.
And according to your studies, what do you expect seeing this for the next years? Lunes, what do you expect
In what
is going
sense?
to happen? It's going to happen with your studies, for instance. What do you think you are going to see in the future?
I'm not sure I'm very good at predicting the future. I'm already, as I think somebody said once, is that we are better. Already have problems predicting the past, so so the future is even a bigger mystery. But I don't know. In Madagascar, you have like everywhere there are these kind of questions. You have opposing forces. You have on one side, let's say, big companies that want to mine, for instance, because people say they want cars that are electric, but actually electric cars are going to destroy most of the forest. Electric cars are presented as if they were ecological. They're not. They're highly dangerous for the planet. Everybody who says, I'm going to move from an oil car to electric car is just saying, okay, I'm going to destroy new things in new ways and maybe quicker. So because to do the batteries, you need minerals. And where are minerals? Mainly in places of high biodiversity. Madagascar, South America, Central Africa. So that's not going to be ecological. Cars are not ecological. They're never going to be. Okay? So
that's a good example.
So I'm saying that there are areas in Madagascar where mining companies are trying to mine more. I try to understand genetic diversity and say things with that. What I'm saying now is also a mixture of science, because
but
it's
ecology,
important
but it's also for us to know your opinion on that.
And here it's important, for instance, at some point you were saying, I mean, it's something that we often say, we say, we humans are destroying the planet. And I say, what does it mean, we humans? We have to clarify, who are the humans who destroy the planet? Because if we don't ask that question properly, we give the impression that everybody is like the 7 billion humans are all doing the same, and it is not true. That is, if you go to Madagascar, you see that people, for instance, when they cut a bit of forest to put a bit of rice to feed their kids, yes, they cut forest where there were lemurs, so that's bad, okay, for that. But they destroy much less of the rest of the planet compared to all of us. So who is doing bad for biodiversity?
Yes.
We do much more, okay? So it is important to understand it's not to say it's good to destroy the forests in Madagascar. It's just that when we say that, we have to be careful about what we do. And it's very, and I'm not an example. I'm just saying that really we should never say we humans are the enemies of nature. That's not true. It's not we humans. Some humans are more enemies of nature, and if we do not.
Christophe, what do you think is your role as scientists in this?
Well, I mean, I'm a professor, so I'm spending half of my time teaching. So I think.
But you are a field man
yeah,
also.
and
no?
I think I'm one of these people who believe that if you want people to conserve, they need to love. If you want them to love, they need to understand. And so my role is to make them love, basically, and that's how I conduct my teaching. I'm trying to make my teaching as enlightening as possible, so that people leaving the room, they think it's great. I really want to see nature now that I have a new idea about what it is and why it's the way it is and not a different way. So I think my role basically is to try to make people feel like they want to go in nature, they want to see what it is, and maybe have a different look, at nature, through a kind of a window through which they can, better understand what they have around them. So yeah, I mean it's a small contribution, I guess, but every year thanks to your lectures, I'm now interested in this, or I've been in this forest, and I didn't realize, that there were so many bird species on campus, I mean, a simple thing like this, and so yeah, I mean, I think through small contributions like this, perhaps, I mean, that's my hope, otherwise I would stop my job and do something else. But I think, yeah, it's education, I think, is a big thing. And my research feeds, I mean, of course, what makes perhaps lectures more interesting is to have professors who know what they're talking about, who have been in the...
People will only try to preserve something if they know in the first place, and then, of course, like or love. And I think most of the time we are only in the first step, because people don't know, even the example here in Portugal. Most of the people don't know that we have dolphins around. So now that everyone is talking about the dolphins around Lisbon, it's like, wow.
Dolphins in
but the
Tejo.
dolphins were around already, so the problem was people didn't know. So yeah, so I think it's important to pass the message. Yeah.
Thank you. We still have some minutes, so I want to know if someone wants to put some question. Anyone? We have there just a little bit, we need the micro.
Hello.
Hi.
I really like the presentation, and so I have two quick related questions for Dinesh. So you said that the population of dolphins in Sado is slowly but surely decreasing in size. So I wonder if there's any practical strategies that are being implemented to stop this problem, right? And maybe also you refer the question of inbreeding. I also wonder if there's some type of methodology to make the dolphins mate outside of their group or something like that.
I didn't understand the first question. You are talking about why the population is decreasing, or
I'm wondering about any practical strategies that are being implemented to stop the decrease in population number.
Well, first of all, we we are collecting data because even before we didn't know many things about the population. That's why I'm doing this study now, because the Natural Conservation Institute needs information to take some measures, but there was a lot of information that they didn't have until now. There is no strategy to, to put dolphins to mate with the others, so that is something that they have to decide to do it. We know that sometimes they are together outside of the Sado with coastal dolphins. We don't know exactly if they mate, but it can happen. What we know is this is not frequent. So, and unfortunately, very few individuals from outside come to the population. So since the 80s, just one individual entry from outside, it was a juvenile that entry in the population alone and stay there. But this makes sense, because if you are a coastal dolphin, a coastal bottlenose dolphin, it's very difficult. You decide to entry in the estuary. First of all, because to enter in the estuary, you have to pass to an area that is very shallow, and the dolphins are not so used to this kind of habitat, and it's completely different environment comparing to the ocean. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Okay.
Hi. My question is, if you know, Ines, at what rate approximately are the numbers of this population decreasing? So if in the next few years we're in danger of losing the population at all?
Well, with a population of this size, we cannot say that this cannot happen. There is not a constant rate. Every year, there are new calves. Normally, there are like one, some years two, some years three. What happens is then some of the calves die, or some of the young juveniles die. That's why the population has been around these numbers in the last decades. So we cannot, I cannot predict that what is going to happen in the future. We know that a big part of the population, there are several individuals that are very, very old, and they have to die one day because they cannot live forever. So when that happens, then of course the population is going to shrink a lot. But we don't know what is going on in the future.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's someone.
Sorry, this question is for Christoph. I wanted to ask if you ever went back and tried to research how many birds there actually were of the new species that you found.
Actually, we went back once, yeah. But it's really difficult to estimate the population size. But what we can say, based on the capture rate using our nets, is that it's probably low density, very low density. It's an uncommon species. But we still have an imprecise idea about the actual distribution range. So we think actually that because some people have observed, birds in a different place that could actually relate to this one. So we think that there are actually two small and disconnected mountain ranges where this species could occur. So we wouldn't say it's like an endangered species. It's probably not an endangered species, but it's still quite rare, actually. It's not something that, even on the place where it occurs, it's not something that you see very easily. So it takes actually a few days when you are on the spot to encounter one individual. So it's quite rare, actually. which is why we don't have any photos in nature. We don't have any recording. We just have like a few photos that we made from the birds captured in the nets, so in the hands, but we don't have like any other documentation because it's so rare. And nobody else than us has actually seen that bird, because nobody else has been able to go back to the same place. But I think it's going to change in the near future, because now people know. So there are some very keen birders already that contacted us, and they said, where is it exactly? Because we want to go there and we want to make photos of that bird. So it's possible that in the near future we'll know more about the numbers, the distribution, and we'll get also photos. But right now it's still a bit uncertain.
For the 7 years that you tried to get the confirmation, what's the exact process that you have to go through?
Well, I mean, you have to make sure that this has not been described before. So you have to go to a museum and check, all the specimens that have been collected before, when specimens have been collected. And so we screened all the specimens of closely related species just to make sure that there was nothing that looked like that. And once we did that, we decided to undertake genetic studies just to kind of establish the relationships, the evolutionary relationships that this particular population had with the other species of the group. So as it turns out that this particular group of birds had never been really studied in detail before, so pretty much we produced the first hypothesis about how they were all related. And an interesting and surprising result was that this population that we found was actually not or its closest relative was not the species that looked more like it, basically. It was a very distinct species from a morphological point of view, which suggests that in that particular group of bird, there's been a lot of evolutionary change in plumage coloration and even size of the birds and so on. So it was really unexpected, in fact. And the people who were very skeptical initially, saying, oh, it may just be a subspecies of that particular one, we could actually demonstrate that this was wrong, because they were actually a close relative to a completely different species that looked also very different.
Thank you.
So it's kind of a detective work, if you want. It's something that we had not planned initially. We were there to do something else. We got that bird in the net, and then it's detective work, starting in a museum and then in the lab, and then contacting as many colleagues as possible to get blood samples of other species and so on, and then conducting getting some DNA sequences sometimes from very old museum specimens, which is not something necessarily very easy to do. And then there is the next step, which is analyzing all this data using population genetics, like Younes is doing, to kind of test hypotheses about how these things got separated from one another through time.
I don't know if there's more questions.
Christophe, I would like to know what is the name of the species.
Good question. Good question. So the genus name is Melanocaris, which means black beauty, and the species name is Citreola. So Citreola means with lemon. So it's got a lemon breast, basically. So we decided to give a name which reflected what the birds look like, basically, rather than giving a name that reflects the geography or to name the birds in honor of someone. We didn't like this idea at all, actually, and so we preferred to give a name that is a good description of the bird. So the scientific name is Melanocaris citreola. And in English, it's lemon-breasted berry pecker, because it's
Thank you.
berry pecker. And the berry pecker family is endemic to New Guinea. I mean, this is the only region in the world where you can find berry peckers.
If there's more questions, other questions? No? Anyone? Okay. So our timing is running out, but I think we could be talking all night here because we all learn a lot, I think. I'm sure. I learned a lot. And it was a pleasure for me talking with you this night and being with you also. And I want to thank to Instituto Gulbenkian Ciência for this invitation. It's an honor for me. So if there's no more questions, I want to thank you, all of you, and I want to thank you, of course, the three of you. And I hope we talk soon again, and you go to New Guinea and bring us new stories and new challenges for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Obrigada.